1 year ago, only about 25% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure was actually functioning at that time. It's going to be an even worse situation this time around, with citywide blackouts already announced by some sort of Ukrainian, cities. I mean, I don't see how they can suffer it, but, it's just becoming a police state. And any dissent will be repressed because Zelensky needs all to carry on for his own, for his own survival, frankly.
Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. There is, we were just saying, probably too much to even touch on, but we're going to try to cover all the subjects related to the madness ensuing regarding the U.S., Russia, Ukraine. There's a lot of fake news out there, and there's also a lot of real developments that in many ways are not so great. So joining me to break all of this down is Ian Proud. We've had him on the show before. He is a former British diplomat who served in His Majesty's diplomatic service from 1999 until 2023, including as economic counselor to the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2019. He now is an author, commentator, and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. So, Ian, thank you so much for joining me today. The first subject I think that we should address is I don't think they've been getting the attention they deserve, but the quite, I guess, massive sanctions that were imposed upon Lukoil and Rosneft. This is important because it's the two largest oil firms in Russia, I believe. The UK imposed sanctions on these entities and 34 subsidiaries last week. The UK made one exemption, and that's for German-owned subsidiaries of either Lukoil or Rosneft. Germany has decided to nationalize these entities. What do you make of all of this? And what do you think the purpose is? And what do you think the actual reality will be when we look at the impacts of this decision?
So I think the impact will be fairly minimal. Bear in mind that Russia's had over 20,000 sanctions imposed on it since 2014, and none of those sanctions have actually had any kind of real effect. They haven't really changed policy towards Ukraine. Russia sees them as entirely illegal and punitive, and will do anything possible in its power to evade their impact. And in any case, Rosneft, Lukoil, Russian oil, gas, generally speaking, has been shifting more towards Asia, away from Europe. So the US and the UK kind of sanctioning Rosneft and Lukoil and surrogate nifty gas, as well, I don't think is really going to make any difference really to the key number, which is, the volume of oil and gas that Russia exports, every year, which has been pretty steady since the war started. What is the purpose of these? The purpose of these is, I think, really that, Western nations like the UK and the US have run out of options to try and influence kind of Russia. President Trump has, been playing a bit with negotiations, but the UK has been determined not to have any negotiations with Russia. And in the absence of a determination to fight Russia on the battlefield, sanctions is the only option that's left. And those sanctions haven't been working. But because it's all that they've got, they continue to kind of push that line. What's going to happen next? I suspect nothing much. Really, I think the war will continue. I suspect the EU and the UK will probably impose more sanctions, which also won't have any effect, either. And we'll stay in this circle of doom rather than just getting to the root cause of the conflict and actually negotiating an end to it, which Trump has now seemingly decided against doing.
Do you think that this could have any impacts for third-party countries that the U.S. is trying to strong-arm, like China or India, who've been hit, obviously, with tariffs over their support via funding Russia's war chest, as the State Department has dubbed it, for working with these oil companies and taking, petroleum and refining it? Could this impact those countries or put them in a difficult situation?
I don't think so necessarily. I think the impacts, if there are any, will be on smaller countries, particularly in Africa and Latin America. Countries need energy to survive, to light their homes, to kind of heat them, and all the rest of it. While China and India are sort of big, powerful nations with 1 billion plus population each, big economies, and so on. They won't really care. They won't. Certainly, China won't stop buying Russian oil just because Donald Trump has sanctioned Rosneft. China hasn't backed down in the face of US tariffs. So I don't really see the big players, the most important players, really to Russia, kind of changing, track on that. But I think it could have an economic impact on smaller nations who may worry about blowback from the US and the UK if they continue to buy Russian oil, which will shoot up their oil prices, making their economic situation, even worse. Much like, of course, what has happened in Europe right now, which is deindustrializing, factories closing, people losing their jobs because, people don't want cheap Russian energy. It's bizarre.
Speaking of that, the EU, I believe they feel like they're going to pass, or they have basically approved some measure where they're going to be able to skirt the unanimous consent rules regarding banning Russian gas into the EU. This is what they're talking about this week. Russian gas still is, one of the top gas imports into the EU, mostly to Hungary and Slovakia. What do you make of these efforts, and do you think that they'll finally be successful?
Well, actually, Russian energy imports into the EU are very low, actually, compared to what they were in 2014. But still, yes, countries like Hungary and Slovakia really depend on them for their energy, right? They're kind of landlocked, or Hungary is a landlocked, country, as is Slovakia. That they need sort of good and plentiful supplies of cheap energy. And the bureaucrats in Brussels are telling them to turn off the taps. And indeed, the Ukrainians are even attacking oil depots inside of Hungary, which is a bizarre situation for an EU and a NATO ally, to be attacked, by Ukraine. They may well succeed, but I mean, I don't think it'll have an impact on the big ticket numbers for Russia, but it will have an impact on Hungary in particular in terms of their energy prices. And of course, what it means, in practice, is that it makes Hungary less likely to want Ukraine to join the European Union and to want Ukraine to join NATO. So actually, it becomes self-defeating, because the thing that people always talk about, let's end the war. Nobody seems to want to end the war, but that's what they say, and let Ukraine join the EU. Well, Hungary is letting Ukraine join is going to be the last thing Hungary wants to do after it's been forced to have high energy prices and have Ukrainians attacking its oil depots.
It's crazy. I mean, has the government of Hungary, and I believe it's not just Hungary, I believe there's a few different maybe countries, maybe I'm mistaken, that have had either oil, gas facilities targeted all over the past 48 hours. Has this been called out by governments of the respective nations that have been hit with these terrorism acts?
No, quite the opposite. I mean, the Polish government has applauded it. They've even encouraged it. Radek Sikorski has this ongoing, argument with Peter Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, on X, where, Radek Sikorski, the foreign minister of Poland, an EU and a NATO country, is literally inciting, terrorist acts, obviously on the back of the Nord Stream sort of, acquittal last week, but also encouraging Ukrainians to attack, energy infrastructure that helps Hungary. It's the most bizarre. So, nobody is going to call this out because the Eurocrats are so locked into kind of the war mood that they won't anyway. But what is worrying is that actually Poland is encouraging it. It's quite astounding.
The European Union also just passed their 19th round of sanctions, apparently targeting. They've now targeted crypto exchanges. India and China, I believe, they also targeted this time their business with Russia, I presume, and banks, because apparently they haven't sanctioned enough banks in Russia. I mean, at what point do European citizens sit back and say, we're going in the complete wrong direction? Look at Germany. You don't have to look much further than that to understand this has been a massive mistake. They're shooting themselves in the foot. Do you think that at any point we're going to see European citizens reflect and say, we took the wrong approach here?
Well, I think they are already. You look at the election results in Czechia, recently, where, they've adopted a more sort of nationalist prime minister, a nationalist with a small end, somebody who just doesn't want to have war and wants to have good neighbourly relations with other countries and doesn't want to be dominated by Brussels. Hungary is already in that place, as is kind of Slovakia. Countries want to think about their own needs first. And as you say, in Germany, AfD is becoming the most popular political party. The next elections will be in 4 years' time. In France, it's in 2 years' time. Macron's government is in trouble. The British government is in trouble. As all across Europe, nationalist parties who actually just want to kind of focus on their country's priorities first and not have endless, pointless wars with Russia, sort of gaining popularity. So ordinary people are sort of definitely changing their minds now, but the politicians aren't. And of course, what that means in practice is that we have at least another 2 years of this head in the sand, policy towards war with Russia. But I see essentially over the next 2 to 4 years, these kind of internationalist, globalist governments across Europe falling and being replaced by nationalist alternatives who want a much more normalized security architecture for Europe.
Mm-hmm. We saw that this week last night there was a very viral article in the Wall Street or Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, saying that Trump had lifted restrictions on long-range missile use for Ukraine. Trump came out not too long after and said, this is fake news. I didn't do that. My question to you is, have there ever been any restrictions on long-range missile? I'm left wondering, what are these so-called restrictions? Because as I understand, Ukraine literally doesn't have the capability to even fire these missiles. Trump came out and said, we'd have to train them. If we were to fire them today, it'd have to be U.S. personnel firing them. If we wanted to train Ukrainians, it'd take half a year. Ukraine is obviously doing missile and drone attacks deep into Russia, missile attacks and more shallow operations near the border. But I mean, what is this story about there constantly being restrictions lifted? They've said this multiple times.
Well, the maximum range of Western munitions inside of, from Ukraine into Russia is only about 350 miles. Currently, with the Storm Shadow and Atacms capability they have, Trump has refused to kind of give Tomahawk missiles. Most of these attacks, places like Chelyabinsk in the Urals, all over, further into Russia, are happening through drones, not missiles. But then certainly some Western military powers are undoubtedly helping the Ukrainians with this, even if they're not producing the drones. The British most certainly are and have been right since the start of the war. So, I mean, I think that there are no kind of restrictions de facto, but I think the Ukrainians are much more careful about using the Western munitions, the kind of shorter range Western munitions like Storm Shadow, and so on, because of the obvious response I'll get from Russia, which we saw last year with the use of the Oreshnik missile pretty much 1 year ago, right? So, I mean, that, it's a lot of hot air. That story spun out on the back of all the kind of stuff around Tomahawk missiles and Zelensky's request, to have, those. But, as you say, Ukraine can already strike deep into Russia. And I believe that's, with the help of Western military powers, whether or not they're supplying the munitions themselves.
Former President Medvedev of the Russian Federation, he came out and said if Kirill Dmitriev, I guess, is the good cop, he's the bad cop, as we all know, in the negotiations with the West. He came out and said today that Trump has assumed responsibility for this NATO proxy war against Russia, and he is this is his war now. Do you think that is I usually agree with what Medvedev says. Do you think that's a fair characterization of where we're at now?
No, Medvedev is always kind of far out there with his statements, isn't he? On the war. Well, no, I know, but I mean, I don't disagree or necessarily agree. But I mean, what I do think is the case is that Trump's position is deeply confused. Every time somebody goes to visit him and lays on the charm, his position seems to change. There's no real consistency, in his approach. He's wanted to have negotiations. Now he doesn't want to have negotiations. And from his point of view, this is just a business deal anyway, right? Because, America isn't paying for the weapons that Ukraine is getting. Europe is paying for those. So from Trump's point of view, he's not hugely invested in whether the war ends or it doesn't end, whatever he says, about his desire for peace and wanting the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, I think if he really wanted the war to end, he could apply pressure on the Europeans to do so, as he did with pressuring them to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP. But he's not doing that. And so he's flip-flopping from one position to the other. And it must be deeply confusing for the Russians as it is for us here, in Europe. But I mean, from the European and NATO point of view, they're happy with that anyway, because they can just continue this pointless war, which Ukraine is losing anyway. So from Europe's point of view, they're happy that Trump's where he is. I don't think, I think the Americans are doing everything possible to avoid being in the war. And, if he succeeded in one thing, Trump has succeeded in that. They're just earning lots of money from it.
Mm-hmm. Ukraine just approved their largest military spending annual bill in their history. There's questions as to how Ukraine is going to even manage their total annual budget by April. They've been relying in previous years upon the U.S. to fund basic services in the country, as we know. I guess this leads me to the question of who's going to be funding Ukraine, because the U.S. seems very hesitant. Europe is probably much more willing, but lacks the capability. Ukraine's not getting the Tomahawks. They're not getting the air defense missiles that they need. They admitted this week, finally, that the Russian missiles, all 24 of them in a recent strike, penetrated what remains of the air defense. They're not even trying to hide this fact anymore. What becomes of Ukraine over the next 6 months?
Well, Ukraine is already bankrupt. It can't borrow any money from Western capital markets because it doesn't pay back any repayments on its debt, and hasn't done really since not just the start of the war, but before the war. So Ukraine is bankrupt, and it needs $50 billion every year, at least. And that number always seems to go up. It used to be 40 billion. It's now 50 billion, goes up all the time, to kind of keep the war going, because, 2/3 of the Ukrainian budget is defense. And so therefore, we are paying for the war 50 billion a year. And that money now, as it's not coming from the US, is coming from Europe. And of course, what they're trying to do now is this cunning wheeze where they kind of basically steal this 140 billion of the total Russian foreign exchange assets, frozen in Belgium to back a loan to, Ukraine that they call a reparations loan. It's got nothing to do with reparations. It's about fighting the war. The German chancellor said, well, this 140 billion could help Ukraine keep fighting for another 3 years. Well, I doubt that, because, they'd need even more money than 140 in 3 years. And by that time, they'd be devastated anyway. So, the Europeans don't want to pay. So therefore, they're trying to steal Russia's money to fund this. And that's basically where we are right now.
What do you think the genuine limitations are for the Europeans who want to just seize all those assets? I mean, they've already frozen them, but to seize them and hand them over to Ukraine?
Well, France has no money. They can't keep on to a government for more than a few weeks at a time right now, because France has been running massive, fiscal surpluses since 1974. Every single year, they have no money. Their governments are falling because the governments want to make cuts. Well, on top of that, how are they going to throw in another 10 billion, say, into the Ukrainian pot for war every year? They can't do it. They just can't do it. And if they do it, they'll face massive political resistance within France to this, when the government is trying to cut services to ordinary French people. French people if you know anything about French people, they like to come out and protest and strike. Well, France aren't going to pay any more money for the Ukraine war. That brings us back to Germany, which is deindustrializing, fast. Britain doesn't have any money. We're already looking to raise our taxes because we're spending too much as it is. We just can't afford to hypothetically throw another 10, 15 million into Ukraine for a war every year. We can't do it. So that then puts all the burden on Germany, which is deindustrializing, which, is seeing a rise in popularity of the AfD party. How are they going to justify that to their citizens when Annalena Baerbock, the terrible former foreign minister who's now somehow been given the job as UNGA General Secretary in the UN. She was on an interview the other day saying, well, I don't really care about, the impact this has on ordinary German people. We should keep supporting Ukraine anyway. Well, good luck with that. So, the Europeans don't have the money for this, and they know it, and that's why they're trying to steal this cash. And of course, what happens if they fail? What happens if the Belgians don't agree? That then puts them in a very difficult spot. They may actually have to say to Zelensky, well, it's now time to sue for peace and have elections, and sorry if you are out of a job after that.
So the Belgians are the main. I mean, I understand the U.S. has at least publicly vocalized their opinion to this, whether or not it's theater or not, whether or not they actually care, who knows? But the Belgians are the ones holding this up. Why is that?
Well, because the theoretical money is in Belgium, in Euroclear, and so
they'll be legally liable in that case.
They'll be legally liable, but more than that, I mean, which developing country will want to invest in Belgium or use Euroclear if they steal Russia's assets? I mean, nobody, So that's going to have big economic consequences for Belgium if they agree to this. Actually, the French are against it as well. The French are really worried about this too. But the biggest impact is, of course, on Belgium. Their financial credibility being completely shredded. They have asked for legal guarantees from every European member state that they will back them up if they face legal repercussions, which of course they will. But the biggest repercussions will be economic.
Mm-hmm. One final question for you. Ukraine is, I mean, of course, they're still being hit hard by missile strikes, drone strikes every day, every other day. But, regardless of that happening and it having happened for quite some time, it seems as though their energy grid, their energy sector is just becoming irreparable at this point. It's completely crumbling. They lack the capability to produce basic energy now in some instances, in some cases. And you also have Russia, who has begun, after strikes on petrochemical and oil facilities increasing in Russia by the Ukrainians, you have Russia who is targeting transportation lines inside of Ukraine now as well. I mean, again, the question, can they feasibly last? Can the people hold out? Because you have Ukrainian politicians and figures now coming out and saying, well, if grandma is freezing to death, just try to make do, essentially. This is what they're telling their people now. How can they hold out in a situation like this for much longer?
Well, Ukraine is becoming increasingly repressive. They've just revoked the citizenship of the governor of Odessa because he allegedly has a Russian passport, even though he's popular in Odessa. Any political opponent to Zelensky gets banned, silenced. TV channels are taken down. It's just becoming a repressive police or militarized kind of state, and so that's how they're suppressing dissent. And of course, we saw protests back in July after they tried to kind of stop the anti-corruption bodies. Right now, so many people have left Ukraine that I suppose it's easier for the Ukrainians to continue to repress their own people by cutting off access to real news, stripping political opponents of their powers and so on. But I think at some point Ukrainians have got to stand up and say, well, can't we just end this war? Because nothing's really improving for us. Our lives are just getting worse. But right now, I see no signs of that. 1 year ago, they were saying, this is 1 year ago, that only about 25% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure was actually functioning at that time. Now, of course, some of that was repaired, but I mean, it's going to be an even worse situation this time around, with citywide blackouts already announced by some sort of Ukrainian, cities. I mean, I don't see how they can suffer it, but it's just becoming a police state, and any dissent will be repressed because Zelensky needs all to carry on for his own, for his own survival, frankly.
Ian Proud, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining me today. Where is the best place for people to follow your work online, and where can they purchase your book?
They purchased my book on Amazon, A Misfit in Moscow, but I'm the Peacemonger on Substack, and I'm Proud Diplomat on X. So please do follow me there. I'd much appreciate it.
Very good. We'll have it linked in the description. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. All the best. Have a great day.